The opinions expressed by the host and guests in this show are not necessarily the views of Children's Health Defense.
Good morning, CHD. Today I'm going to do something a little bit different. I don't have a guest, and I'm going to talk to you about classified and unclassified work by secret agencies of the U.S. government. And the first half of the show, I'm going to focus on the two sets of documents that were released by Tulsi Gabbard on June 12th and June 18th, just a week and 2 weeks ago. And in the second half of the show, I'm going to talk about what Mike Benz, who is a lawyer, he is a former official at the State Department and a White House speechwriter, has been revealing using open source documents about the intelligence agencies and USAID in particular. So a lot of this information will be new to viewers who are not familiar with Mike Ben's work, and I can't recommend him high enough. I can't. He is the person who has taught me more about what is going on behind the scenes of the U.S. government than probably anyone else, and can explain the mechanisms within the U.S. government that have led to worldwide changes, such as the worldwide adoption of the COVID pandemic response. So we're going to give you his URL. We're going to, in the show notes, we're going to give you information on how to find him on 3 Joe Rogan podcasts. And I urge everyone here, even if you don't have the time, make the time to listen to Mike Benz. This is the most important information you can probably hear anywhere. So let me start with Tulsi Gabbard. Tulsi was a Democrat. She was a young Democrat from Hawaii, a Hindu, and a member of Congress who rose quickly within the Democratic Party and then left it suddenly. And ran for president, and then joined the Trump administration after Mr. Kennedy as director of national intelligence. And she had been in the military and a military reservist, even, I believe, while she was in Congress. And she's someone that everybody liked and seemed to be a straight shooter. Allegedly, she was not well liked within the DNI, Director of National Intelligence office. Now, the DNI, while nominally that person is supposed to be overseeing all 17 or 18 U.S. intelligence agencies, which exist within many agencies, really the DNI is not the top person. The head of the CIA, for example, would be much more important than the DNI. But the DNI does have certain abilities, and she got together a team of officers seconded from other intelligence agencies, including the CIA, to look into various, I would say, cover-ups or scandals during the Biden and first Trump administration. And one of those issues was the cover-up of the origin of COVID. And interestingly, a CIA officer named James Erdman was a whistleblower before Congress on April 30th. I talked about this briefly in my blog. And what he presented to Congress about Fauci and about the cover-up of the origins of COVID is completely congruent with the information that has been released by the DNI's Tulsi Gabbard's office over the last couple of weeks. So, and he was, in fact, leading the team that was investigating this for Tulsi Gabbard. Now, the first release of documents was only 4 pages. and the font was very small. It was very difficult to read. You actually had to sort of blow it up to see what it had to say. And I wrote a Substack post about this here, which I would urge you to go to if you want to actually see what was in those 4 documents. What I have to say about it is Tulsi billed this as a declassification and a release of never before seen documents. Now, that wasn't entirely true. Almost all of this was previously known. Many of the information, most of the information had already been declassified or was never classified. However, she did acknowledge that there were 120 biolabs around the world that the US government was paying for, and that 40 of them at least were in Ukraine. And she provided some information about the costs of 4 of these labs in Ukraine, and she provided additional information about one of them and a map of where 13 of them were located. And of those 13, only one was actually a high containment lab. High containment labs are called BSL-3 or BSL-4, biosafety level. The biosafety level 2, which the other 12 labs were allegedly, is equivalent to what you'd find in a university or a hospital, which means unauthorized personnel are not allowed in. You have to wear a lab coat. You have to, wear safety glasses and gloves. And if you're working with pathogens that are infectious, you do that under a hood, which means you sit at a desk which has a sort of a container around you that sucks the air away from you so that any aerosolized bacteria or viruses that you're working on are not going to be released into the laboratory. So that's a BSL-2. It's no big deal. And I've worked under BSL-2. Everybody really who's worked in a lab probably has, certainly a hospital lab. So what all did this mean? Well, the documents were old with some appended information at the bottom of some of the documents. There were 4 pages and there were approximately 8 actual documents placed on those pages with a few comments. However, they contain significant redactions. They don't have dates showing when they were written, and they don't show to whom they were written and the purpose for which they were written. You can here, if we look at them, for example, you see that this supposedly declassified document was never classified, and it's simply reporting on a CNN program which showed that the Department of Health and Human Services was reviewing NIH grants that included money for the Wuhan lab. So the intelligence agencies were interested in the fact that the public was being informed of federal payments to the Wuhan lab. And as you can see here, I don't know if you can see a date or not on this. There we go. This was in June of 2021. So the intelligence agencies were watching this, but it's nothing classified. Next slide, please. And you can see here, basically, the entire slide is redacted. So this is not a real declassification, is it? Is there one more from that group? Or have we hit the end? That's it. Okay. Now, the amount of money that is claimed in these documents for the 4 labs was under $10 million. So approximately $2 million and a bit on average for each of the 4 labs, which makes it seem to me, knowing how much labs cost, if you're building a real good BSL-3 or BSL-4 lab, you're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars. So it was odd that 4 of these labs only cost less than $10 million, supposedly. Well, I looked up, Black & Veatch was the US contractor, and they subcontracted to other companies to help build and monitor and do whatever with these labs. But Black & Veatch was receiving hundreds of millions of dollars a year for its lab in Ukraine. And in fact, Black & Veatch, along with several other contractors, were getting billions, at least $1 billion a year. So over a period of, this all started right around between 2005 and 2008. So they received many billions of dollars to perform the work at these labs, whatever the work was. And it's not at all clear from these documents what the work was. If you could go back to that last slide, please, you'll see that that money paid for many entities, many consulting companies, UN, other federal agencies. There was a lot of money being thrown around, and $10 million would go nowhere near to being able to support all these different entities who were all involved with these Ukraine biolabs. So let me summarize again. There is no credible explanation provided as to what these labs were doing. The most juicy part of this document was listing a bunch of potential biological warfare agents that were being studied, and this list corresponds to what the Russians released. That not this slide yet, please. No, corresponds to what the Russians had released when they took over at least one of these labs in 2022. So it was a very minimal release, but did acknowledge that we had a lot of biolabs in Ukraine, and it didn't acknowledge much more, and was completely along the same vein as the CIA whistleblower testimony of about a month earlier. Now, Tulsi released a second set of documents on June 18, and these were primarily about Tony Fauci and his role in suppressing, in trying to convince the American public and the intelligence agencies that COVID was a naturally occurring virus. And so the CIA whistleblower, James Erdman, that was basically what he was telling Congress. And that is what this whole document release of 67 documents was trying to support, that claim that Fauci was guilty of creating a dog and pony show to make the intelligence agencies and the American public and the media think that COVID was a naturally occurring virus, that it did not come from a lab, that it certainly didn't come from a lab that his agency had supported, that he was guilty of nothing, that he had not, perjured himself, lying to Congress during hearings when he had taken an oath to tell the truth. And it is a crime to perjure yourself, et cetera. So let me go back to that slide you just showed, which is the list of the 67 titles. Now, if you look at this list, first of all, they don't even align to the left. It's very difficult to read. So if they're trying to make a document that the public can have access to, you make it in a font that is readable and you left align it. That wasn't done. And you link each of these documents to each of these titles to the document that was released. Of course, there are no links either. So this clearly was not made to be user-friendly. Now, if we look at the next slide, I'll give you some examples of what is in this document release. Can you, zoom out? Thank you. So this is a declassification of an unclassified document. And what is it saying? This is an intelligence community document that notes that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and Children's Health Defense are calling for a congressional investigation of COVID origins, or early, by October of 2020. Now, why would you release that? This is padding. You're trying to make it look like you're doing a big release of classified documents when you're padding it. Next slide. This one, again, just a brief statement, and some of it has been redacted. I just took a part of this page. This shows how Fauci is laying the framework for the fact that this was, spread by the Huanan seafood market and that it was a natural occurrence. Next slide. You can see again, this was all unclassified, and yet they've declassified it, but redacted everything. So it's completely worthless. Next slide. Again, it was an unclassified document. This was the one I said that CNN, it was a CNN show. Next slide. Again, completely redacted, worthless. So what I'm telling you is that this large document release of 67 documents, which was almost 400 pages, was mostly padding. It was not helpful. But it did, scattered amongst all these padded documents, it did tell the story, and only the story, of how Tony Fauci created a narrative and pushed it on the intelligence community. So the purpose of these documents was to make Tony Fauci the guilty party and the intelligence community the dupe of Tony Fauci. Now, I wrote a Substack about this a few days ago, and if you could put that up, and we'll give the audience the URL for it. Let's see. Okay, so this was my Substack about her first release, and as I said, all the documents that she released, I blew up and are in this Substack. And if you could give the actual URL for that one, it would be good, because it was a week ago. Now, if in fact, so the purpose of this second release is to acknowledge that COVID was made in a lab, but the lab was in China, not in the United States. There is no discussion of American scientists who might have created part of the COVID genome or all of it. Ralph Baric is not, maybe he's mentioned once or twice, but he's not focused on in any way, even though he is the world's probably preeminent COVID scientist, coronavirus scientist and expert on COVID. And Ralph Baric was invited by Tony Fauci to listen in on the February 1 phone call, which had about a dozen scientists, including the authors of the COVID origins paper, which was used by Fauci and Francis Collins and others to allegedly prove that this couldn't have come from a lab. So anyway, what this document release does is acknowledge, okay, it came from a lab. The lab was in China. We're focused on the Chinese scientists. And Fauci, pretends he's interested in this. He asks the intelligence community to find out about those sick Chinese scientists and find out about the seafood market and all that. But so here's the bottom line. The Chinese lab leak is the second cover story. Okay, it's a limited hangout. It's more than a limited hangout. It's a limited hangout means they're telling you some of the truth, but not all of the truth. This is designed to make you forget that there were people in the United States working on coronaviruses and designing coronavirus vaccines and doing all of that, and put all the blame on China. Now, but it's the reason why they're willing to acknowledge this much is because they think that they can fool the public and make them think this is a big news story, and we don't have to go any further, that this explains everything. But it doesn't, because if it was made in a lab, or if it had a zoonotic origin, that does not explain why appropriate treatments were suppressed, why a very toxic design for the virus was chosen. It doesn't explain why they had to roll out a completely new vaccine platform, the messenger RNA, when we had other platforms and that could have come online basically as quickly. There was no reason to put in the HIV inserts, and there was no reason to include SV40, the virus that helps whatever was in the vaccine to enter the nucleus of our cells and potentially cause mutations that might in some people actually be transferred to their children. And there was no reason to add other things that it was known could directly impair our immune system and our immune surveillance for cancer. And now we're seeing, a large increase in cancer cases as a result of the vaccine and probably the virus as well. If the federal agencies were honest, once they realized some of this, realized the vaccine was causing problems, they would have stopped using it. They would have changed the design or said, look, COVID has become a minor problem. It's like a cold. You don't need to get a vaccine at all for it. But they've never done that. It's been 5.5 years, a week more than 5.5 years since the first mRNA Pfizer vaccine rolled out to the public. And the federal agencies have not stopped pushing this vaccine. They have not stopped buying this vaccine. And so they have a lot to account for, and none of these releases give them a pass. So we must not let the COVID experience be delegated simply to lab error. All right. Now, Fauci was trying to preserve his reputation, preserve his ability to make tons of money now. He's making, I think, I was told, I don't know if this is true, $2 million a year from Georgetown to be on their faculty. He's probably being paid a lot for speeches and for books and other things he's producing. And he is the person who commissioned the Proximal Origins paper and reviewed it before it was published, along with Jeremy Farrar, as an important, necessary part of the cover-up. Okay. Now, the other thing that these releases did not do was they did not explain why doctors were punished who were telling the truth about the virus and the vaccine. They don't explain why there was tremendous censorship of all information that went against the government's story about the virus and the vaccine. They don't explain the punishment of vaccine refusers. And there's certainly no apologies here. Okay. Let me move on now to Mike Benz. As I said, Mike Benz is just amazing, and everybody watching this show should get on his Twitter feed and watch his shows with Yanya Kellogg. 3 shows, at least 2 shows with Yanya Kellogg, at least 3 shows with Joe Rogan, and other shows that I was on one show with him once quite a while ago. What I'm going to talk to you about today is mostly from his show number 2272 on Joe Rogan, which was about 16 months ago. And he explains that after World War II, the Cold War was really, I want to say it was heating up. The Cold War was becoming a big deal. The Soviet Union was clearly our enemy, even though they had been our ally at the end of World War II. George Kennan was a theoretician, politician, historian who came up with a plan for how to approach how U.S. foreign policy should be managed during the Cold War so that we could win, we could supersede the Soviet Union, which, remember, had many countries. Remember, Soviet Union had a bunch of, half of Europe was part of the Soviet entity. So in 1947, the National Security Council was founded and the CIA was founded. The CIA was an offshoot of the OSS, which had occurred during World War II. And then in 1946, President Truman had created the Central Intelligence Group, and then that was converted by Congress into the Central Intelligence Agency. And the National Security Council was designed to make the policy that would basically be carried out by the State Department, the CIA, and then later also the NSA, which was formed in 1952, and USAID. Now, international law banned the taking over of foreign territory by war through grossly offensive means. So the United States could not, go into Cuba or the Philippines or Puerto Rico, as it had done, to actually take over those territories from Spain, from the Spanish Empire. We had to do things other ways, and France still had French Indochina. And so what the United States decided to do was, then when I say the United States, I'm talking about the deep state, the people who really run things and who really want to take over the world and gain access to resources around the world and become as rich as possible, and control the workings of every other nation. These people were in control of the CIA, the NSA, the later USAID, etc., and the State Department, and probably the military. And they realized that what they had to do, or what they chose to do, was to win the hearts and minds and the politicians of every nation around the world. And they needed to control who got elected, what laws were passed, and what policies were implemented in every other nation. So it sounds very dark. It is very dark. And this would require control of media around the world and control of culture, or we had to defeat the Soviet Union culturally. Now, at that time, the Soviet Union, Russia has produced wonderful composers, the best ballet in the world, wonderful novelists, many artistic, painters and the artistry of the Soviet Union was very well recognized around the world, and ours was not. So a lot of money was spent in cultural exchanges and the pushing of jazz and modern art as being, equivalent to these older forms of art. Congress understood they were creating a monster when they did this, when they created the CIA in 1947 and these other agencies. And so they passed the Smith-Mundt Act in 1948, 1 year after creation of the CIA and the National Security Council, to stop the propaganda that was being pushed out around the world by us secretly, to stop it from blowing back into the United States and stop these agencies from propagandizing our own citizens. The National Security Act, which formed the CIA and the National Security Council, did allow for dirty tricks, and it reorganized U.S. foreign policy and the military establishment in major ways. The CIA immediately started going after judges, the military, universities, unions, politicians, and the media around the world, particularly in hotspots, and started funding media organizations. And the CIA had something called the Great Wurlitzer, which could be played like an organ and could push out any narrative it wanted to media, around the world, to convince the world public of these narratives. And people did not realize, as Mike Benz says, that they were being subjected to a Truman Show. And by the way, so have we. And that's a very important concept to understand. And this is since essentially 1950. So my entire life, I was born in 1951. Now, this Smith-Mundt firewall to stop the agencies propagandizing America. Of course, they did in some ways, but specific propaganda that they had created for Radio Free Europe or other entities could not be, those things could not be spread in the US, but certainly other things were. And I would like to say that Wurlitzer played clearly played in the US as well. We know there were so many CIA and intelligence agencies ties to media within the US. So during the Obama administration, Congress essentially repealed the Smith-Mundt Act, which was the firewall. They voted for it in 2012, and Obama signed it in 2013. It was called the Smith-Mundt Modernization Act, and it allowed propaganda freely to be spread to Americans. Now, Mike Benz points out that operations that were too dirty for the CIA to undertake went to USAID. The budget of USAID, and I've talked about USAID while it was in existence. It was ended in the first month of Trump's administration. I talked about USAID because it had an incredible budget of $44 billion a year, more than the CIA's budget. And the CIA its operations need presidential approval. But because USAID was not supposed to be an intelligence agency or a military agency, its actions did not require presidential approval. So doing dirty operations through USAID gave the administration, plausible deniability, which is extremely important to politicians. And so USAID started funding networks around judges in every country, and this was their policy. They called it judicial reform. They also had a policy called capacity building. And these two were used to pay off networks around the media, around the universities, around the prosecutors and the judges, et cetera, so that everybody would be on side with what the US deep state was looking for. Some of you may remember the Panama Papers. This was a huge release. I think there were terabytes of information about a company in Panama, law firm, that created fake offshore tax havens for the wealthiest people and the most famous people in the world. And, my life is weird. I've had connections with so many weird people that I know some of the people involved in this stuff. So actually, the company that set up these offshore firms was called Mossack Fonseca. And one of my sons actually dated the daughter of Mossack when they were both in college about 25 years ago. And I believe it was my impression then that the father had come from Germany, probably around World War II, and moved to Panama and started this law firm. Customers of Mossack Fonseca included the father of the UK Prime Minister David Cameron and many others. I mean, it was quite a scandal. Well, it turns out that USAID provided half the funding for the investigative journalists who worked on the Panama Papers. And it's very likely that the CIA or the NSA provided that group of journalists with these terabytes of information because they wanted them to go after enemies. So within that set of documents were enemies of the deep state, targets that they wanted to smear with these offshore accounts. And it's interesting that the USAID even bragged about the fact that they had spent $20 million over 5 years on some of this investigative journalism, and it led to 500 policy changes, getting rid of 21 high officials who had to resign or were sacked, and led to regime change. And what we've come to find out from Mike Benz is that one of the goals of this USAID funding was to actually take the political enemies. So if you were in a party, let's say Bolsonaro in Brazil, if you were in a party that the US deep state did not want to win an election or run a country, they not only wanted you to lose the election, but they wanted the prosecutors to go after you and put you in jail, and throw away the key, basically. And so this was done, or fined for great large amounts of money. So this was actually a policy of USAID, was to get political candidates into massive legal trouble. And if you think about it, think about elections in Europe. Marine Le Pen, couldn't run because they went after her for some minor thing and blew it up into a big deal. And other people had to not run in France. And this is how the current French Prime Minister Macron actually got in, because other people were smeared who were much more likely to win the French election. There's a slide, if you can find it, Lou, where Mike Benz, it's just it's a black background, and it shows 7 elections in Latin America that have taken place since the end of USAID. And here you go. In the 7 elections that have taken place since USAID stopped funding people, each one has been won by the so-called, and now I don't think right and left have much meaning anymore, but the so-called far-right candidate. So these were presumably all candidates that USAID would have been funding the opposition candidate, funding the prosecutors, funding a whole network of people to go after. And they probably would have lost all those elections. Now, some people may remember that when President Biden was the vice president, he spoke at a Council of Foreign Relations meeting in New York and told a story about how he had been in Ukraine and had been talking to the whoever the head of Ukraine was at the time. This was during the Obama administration, and telling them to fire the head prosecutor who was investigating Burisma. Now, you may remember that Hunter Biden was on the board of Burisma. I don't know if he was at that exact moment, but certainly Hunter Biden so-called earned, was given millions of dollars to be on the board of Burisma. Burisma was a corrupt company. Burisma was actually an ally of USAID. And so Biden said, look, I threatened the head of Ukraine. I told him the $1 billion you were going to get for that we were going to give you will be canceled unless you fire the prosecutor investigating Burisma. And I'm leaving this country in 6 hours, and it needs to be done by then. And it was. And so Ukraine got that $1 billion. Where did the $1 billion come from? USAID. USAID does not confine itself to overseas operations. It also pays for U.S. operations. So Mike gave the example of how USAID funds an NGO in San Francisco called the Tides Center. And then the Tides Center turns around, takes that money, and funds prosecutors again, and funds people who can become U.S. attorneys for each state or for big cities. And this is a mechanism by which law and order in the United States can be managed basically by the deep state. I hadn't understood that before. I didn't think it was possible for us, for the US government, for our taxpayer money to be spent on, I thought this money must come from George Soros or somewhere else, but no, a lot of it actually comes from taxpayer money to sick US, what are they called? US attorneys for each state on Americans who are political enemies of the deep state. It's also noted by both Mike Benz and Elon Musk that 90% of the media in Ukraine are funded by the United States, by USAID, 90%. So the Ukrainians are also living in a Truman Show. Now, USAID funded one organization with a tremendous amount of money. So $500 million a year of their total $44 billion went to one NGO, supposedly a nonprofit, called Internews. I was particularly interested because the CEO of Internews is a woman, and she used to live basically down the road from me. I lived in Ellsworth until this week, Maine, and she lived in Blue Hill, where I would go shopping, maybe 14 miles from me. But she had worked for USAID in the past. She'd probably worked for the intelligence community. Her bio says she had managed $250 million in grants while she was working for USAID in Moscow. But the $500 million she was responsible for was spent to basically corrupt and control media and train media around the world. But she also was involved with censorship. So she gave a talk at the World Economic Forum and urged the other members of the World Economic Forum to put pressure on companies. So companies advertise, cigarette companies, Coca-Cola, whatever, laundry detergent, they advertise, not all, but most companies pay for advertising. She said, we have to stop the advertising dollars going to media that spread misinformation, disinformation, or have the wrong people on those media. And so this plan was put into effect. And there was a lot of pressure placed on companies to stop advertising with what was considered right-wing media. And so many right-wing media folded. And it was, and Substacks, don't subscribe to their Substacks, don't do this and that. And Mike Benz points out that 99% of the advertising for, what was it called? Bannon used to run it. The guy who founded it died young. Oh, it was on the tip of my tongue. Anyway, that large media enterprise lost 99% of its funding because of this effort by Jean Bourgeot, and who knows how these things. Thank you. You can put that slide up. Jean Bourgeot and her company. Thank you. Steve Bannon is funded with offshore cash. Well, that wasn't my slide. Yes, that one with Jean Bourgeot's picture. This is the woman who spends $500 million of your tax money to censor you and censor people around the world. And so they were responsible for much of the censorship during COVID, as well as other censorship. If you take that last slide in my last set, you'll see that one of their big things now, and this is funded through another NGO, yes, thank you, the Carnegie Foundation, is climate change. So they want to control the climate narrative online and tackle climate disinformation, which is people like me telling the truth about the climate. But remember, these people have access to so much money, they can control the narrative globally as well as in the US. So let me now go to the last set of slides that are taken from Mike Benz. And I'm just going to go through them one by one and show you some of the receipts for what I'm saying. So here, USAID was funding over 6,200 journalists across over 700 media outlets and 279 so-called media NGOs. That's pretty impressive. Next slide. You wouldn't think that USAID or the deep state cares about people who are telling you about the problems with GMOs. But when you think about it, Bill Gates has been fighting to force GMOs down our throats, and USAID paid to smear activists like me who talk about the problems with GMOs. And as you know, some of the scientists who have talked about this have lost their jobs as well. Next slide. Shred and burn all documents. So this is true. If the acting head of USAID ordered all of the USAID employees to come in when Trump ended USAID early last year, she ordered all the employees to come in March of 2025. Remember, they've been working at home, most of them. Next slide. And here is her email to them. If you can load up, thank you. Good afternoon. Shred as many documents first and reserve the burn bags for when the shredder becomes available or needs a break. So let's destroy all. If USAID was an aid agency, which they want you to think they are, but they're not, why do they have to shred and burn all their documents once Trump wants to start looking at them and the public? So that's pretty damning evidence that something very unsavory was going on. Next slide. Is that it? Okay. So I appreciate everybody listening in, and I hope you've learned something. And if you have any questions, send them to me and I'll try to cover them in a subsequent show. Goodbye.
Okay, we're live. Woohoo! What's your name?
Michaela.
How old are you, Michaela?
17.
Excellent. And you are mummy?
Kira.
And I'm not going to ask you how old you are.
Thank you.
Okay, let's talk about your children, your life, and what happened.
I have 3 girls. My oldest is almost 21. She is fully childhood vaccinated. We went with the full schedule. Michaela, we did a spaced out schedule. So she had her MMR later than she should have. And she was about 6 years old then I didn't know why she was having seizures, but it took me about a year to figure it out.
So 6 years old?
Yeah. She was perfectly healthy until then.
Can you remember having that? 6 years old, not really. Interesting. So describe in a bit more detail what happened after she had that MMR.
It was kind of a backwards story for me. She started having the seizures, and you get caught up with why, and I knew nothing about epilepsy, so we were going to all the best hospitals in Boston Children's. That's where you bring your kids, right? Because you live in Boston. So they couldn't tell me why They actually said that it was a fluke the first time and that they couldn't figure out why she was having seizures and there was nothing causing it. So after all the testing, they told us not to fill her prescriptions. So we didn't, because we didn't know. And it was a couple days after that that she had another seizure at my house that was about 14 minutes long. It took 2 doses of rescue meds to get her breathing again. And again, I went back to Boston Children's, where they then wouldn't let us leave the hospital unless we put her on medication. So here I am, not knowing what to believe, because they just told me it wasn't going to happen again, and then it happened again, and now I can't leave the hospital without putting her on a medication that I know nothing about. So we chose Keppra, because they said it was the safest, which then turned my daughter into a suicidal mess at 6.5 years old. And then they told me that Keppra rage wasn't a thing. It had nothing to do with the medication. That's not why she was acting like this all of a sudden. So from there, I kind of started digging. There had to have been a reason why my kids started having seizures. And I don't remember, and I wish I could, and maybe you know, who wrote the article about looking for the symptoms in their eyes. One eye goes out, one eye goes up because of the metals and toxins clogging their capillaries. I don't know even how I found this article, but I did, and I went back and I looked at her medical records, and I looked at the pictures that were Google time that same day. The day before, she was bright-eyed, and the day after her vaccine, one eye was out, and one eye was up at the cornfield. She just looked like a completely different child, but you don't see it then. But I had to go back, and luckily I found that article, and that's where it all started, with getting all of this information on vaccines and what they do. And after that, it was just seizure after seizure and medication swaps, and we thought we had her stable. And then April 1st of 2018, we found her unresponsive. It was what should have been SUDEP. She was med flown to Mass General and on life support and complete organ failure. Thank you. Her brain was seizing uncontrollably, and they told me to plan her funeral. But here she is, by the grace of God. He wasn't done with her yet, and now we have to tell her story.
So how are you today? Do you still have seizures?
I haven't had one since then, since 2018.
So
She
what
was
you?
healed.
So, okay.
I
That's
fully
great.
trust in God that, she was in complete organ failure and her brain was seizing for 3 days, and it took 4 hours for her to come back completely healthy.
Wow. So are you careful about what you eat and everything? Are you on, is there anything you're doing that continuing going forward to make sure you strengthen? Nope, nothing.
We
Okay.
do. We pine needle
I mean,
tea.
a
Yeah,
couple
a lot.
things.
Dr. Zelenko Z-Stack. We take everything natural that we can. I really try to watch, but she's a very picky eater, so we try to go with more organic chicken nuggets and things like that, because she's just so picky. Yeah.
And what are you wearing? You're both wearing the same clothes.
Oh, it's our
What does that say?
It's a dance studio.
It says "In God We Trust."
In God we trust, and you have a dance studio.
Yeah, No Greater Love Dance Academy in Rochester, New Hampshire, and if any of them are watching, I just want these parents to know that they are my heroes. They are homeschool moms with unvaccinated kids, and they stand strong in what I wish I had known when my kids were.
Now, do you have an unvaccinated child?
I do.
And how old is that child?
She's 14 now.
She's 40. And how's her health compared to vaccinated?
Day and night. My oldest daughter still to this day every year gets strep throat, fully vaccinated. I really pump her immune system. She doesn't think that we do anything differently. Maybe it's just become normal now, but I really, with the Z-Stack and the vitamin C and ivermectin when
And viewers, just to put in that Children's Health Defence does not give out medical advice. So that's just that. These are not necessarily the views and all that.
No, this is just what we do.
It's just what these people do.
Yep. we decided to do our own research instead of believing the white coats. Except for the frontline doctors. I love them. I have to put that out there too. My youngest daughter, she gets a cold once in a while. She really does.
Which is normal, right? That's what we were talking about before.
Yeah.
No one's saying that unvaccinated kids are not going to get sick. But does she have seizures?
No seizures, no yearly strep, no...
Has she had antibiotics?
No.
See? It's
No.
unbelievable, isn't it? Now, how does that make you feel as a mother, though, that you were lied to and stripped of the childhood that these should have had, you know?
It made me very angry for a long time until I realized that our path for God and for this country is to, you know, stand up and say something, because we have to. We absolutely... And she wasn't saved in 2018 to not help other kids and help other families. It's just what we have to do at this point. You know, it made me very angry for a long time, but now I see it almost as a blessing in a weird way, because I still have her and she's doing normal teen things now. You know, she's driving, and I never thought I'd hear her voice again. She's teaching young kids, and she's just going to be a huge influence on the studio. I know she is. So
You teach dance?
I'm learning to teach it because I'm personally taking classes myself now. So I'm working my way up to teaching the little kids.
And what do you want to be when you grow up?
A cosmetologist. So I'm going into cosmetology because I want to do people's makeup and maybe their hair in the future. But I really want to make people feel pretty, like on their wedding days and special occasions.
It's wonderful. It is a miraculous story. It really is. And we're hearing a lot about, you know, this girl here, 7 years old, took a flu shot. She's dead. The one behind me here. Older children taking shots. And I think it's important that the parents know. Any advice you would like to give the people?
would you like to...
Going forward?
Trust your God-given immunity and do your own research, because I was a young mom and I still now have friends who are young moms, and you know, I can talk until I'm blue in the face about what happened, but I don't want it to happen to their babies. I don't want to have to be there when they're grieving. Just do your own research. There's so much out there. Get on Rumble, Del Bigtrue is the first person to make me feel like I wasn't crazy because I wasn't vaccinating my kids anymore. What he did, he's a hero. People really need to just do your own research.
Now you can find the bus. You get to do that.
Which is pretty amazing. I watch these movies on repeat just because sometimes you just need that reminder you're not alone.
You're not alone. No, oh gosh, no. Sadly. All right, thank you so much for telling the story.
46% of the American people say mandates are dangerous, they're damaging, and vaccine science isn't settled.
A steady decline of childhood vaccine rates. Vaccination rates continued to decline last year.
There's a discourse about vaccines that didn't exist before.
Children's health defense.
Children's health defense.
Children's health defense.
Children's health defense.
Children's health defense is the leader in the health freedom movement.
The Department of Health and Human Services is overhauling the immunization schedule, now only recommending 11.
We are making recommendations that are science-based, that are common sense.
Secretary Hegseth, discarding the mandatory flu vaccine requirement.
Your body, your faith, and your convictions are not negotiable.
People recognize you have to be able to make an individualized decision.
For the first time, the U.S. FDA will acknowledge that COVID-19 vaccines killed American children.
states are putting in place medical freedom laws. There's bills in Congress that Children's Health Defense is supporting, the GRACE Act for the right to religious exemptions, the End the Vaccine Carve-Out, ending liability protection, and Tom Massey's bill to repeal the PrEP Act.
One of the most aggressive medical accountability lawsuits in decades.
Suing the American Academy of Pediatrics.
CHD is suing under RICO laws, claiming that the AAP operates as a criminal enterprise and has for decades.
A federal judge yesterday blocked Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s recent overhaul of the nation's childhood vaccine schedule.
They basically just froze all vaccine policy.
The American Academy of Pediatrics and other medical groups filed a lawsuit arguing the vaccine changes violated federal law.
Which is outrageous for a single judge sitting in Boston to stop any work at the Centers for Disease Control related to vaccines.
This conflict between medical freedom and medical coercion, it's a fundamental conflict that we must resolve now in favor of medical freedom or forever be truly slaves to medical tyranny.
I am so glad that there are people like you who are still fighting this.
Children's Health Defense, if you don't know what they do, folks, look it up.
We have got to, as a society, global, decide, is medical coercion okay, or do you have a right to decide what happens to your body?
This and all CHD TV programming is made possible by generous support from viewers like you. Please consider making a contribution today to keep our programming going strong. Thank you.